In the first video, we thought about vaguely how some cards are more valuable than other cards for the player and how you might think about using that information when you're counting cards in Blackjack. We're going to get more specific now. Some of the cards are kind of obvious why they're useful to you. Some are a little bit more questionable. It turns out that aces are an interesting case. In the last video, we saw that aces are good to the player in some scenarios and bad to the player in other scenarios. It turns out on net, aces are good for the player. So if you're playing a shoe that still has a lot of aces in it, that is good news for you if you're the player. The reason for that is, one, is that it makes blackjacks, all right? And it turns out that this value for aces making blackjacks is more important than for tens. Here's the deal. In blackjack, you know, tens, jacks, queens, and kings, you've got 4 different cards that serve to provide a value of 10. But you only have one type of card that serves to give you a value of 11, and that's aces. So here's the deal. Adding some aces into a deck is more important than adding some tens to a deck, because the reason you don't get many blackjacks is because there's not many aces in general. There's just, you know, only 4 out of 52 in single deck blackjack. So if you add some aces in, that's more important than adding some tens in. If you add one ace to a deck, you're going to get a good many more blackjacks. But if you add one more 10 into a deck, it doesn't really actually contribute that much to your expected number of blackjacks that you would earn. So this is important because it pays out 3-2, all right? Anytime you can get paid out more than the typical 1-1, that's very valuable for the player. Second reason why aces are good is that they are good for double downs on 9 and 10. So if you think about playing blackjack, you tend to double down in 3 scenarios. When you have a 9, all right, so for example, if you have a 5 and a 4 and the dealer has a 6, you would double down. Ace would be a great card in that scenario. Another possibility, you have 10. Maybe you've got a 7 and a 3. All right, again, that's going to be a scenario where you double down a lot. So an ace ends up being a good double down card in that scenario. However, it's a bad double down card when you have 11, which is a very common scenario for doubling down. So it's good in some scenarios, bad in others, but it turns out for double downs in general, it's a positive. Getting an ace is usually a good card when you're doubling down. So on net, this is a benefit. And then the third good thing about an ace that maybe is not quite as obvious is it allows for discretion. One good thing about playing blackjack if you're the player, one thing that gives you sort of eats away at some of the house advantage in blackjack is that the player can make choices and the dealer really can't. The dealer is just following rules, but the player can choose what they want to do based on the given scenario. So an ace can be low or high, right? An ace can be 1 or 11. So it has a lot of flexibility. And since the player can use that flexibility more because they get to choose what they're doing, this ends up being valuable for the player, okay? And so on net, you'll see that ace is a good card for the players. Now let's think about those tens, the face cards, right? Tens, jacks, queens, and kings. These also make blackjacks. As I mentioned before, this is not quite as big of a deal because having a 10, for example, as your first card, pretty low probability you'll get a blackjack. But this is still useful, all right? You can't get a blackjack without a 10. All right, so it makes blackjacks. That's a good thing. It is great for double downs. All right, it's on average the best card for doubling down. You tend to double down when you have 11, 10, and 9. And in all of those scenarios, drawing a 10 there would be good. So it's great for double downs, and double downs are important because that's a scenario where you've bet twice as much, essentially. And then most importantly here, a 10 is great because it is the most likely card to cause a dealer bust. Okay. Tens cause dealer busts more than any other card. 1, because they're a high number, and 2, because There's 10s, jacks, queens, and kings, right? In single deck blackjack, there's 16 of those suckers. So when the player has 14 and the dealer's got 15, the 10 is going to bust. The 10 is the most common bust card. So this ends up being a really important scenario, okay? So these are good cards. 9s are good cards for the player too, for a lot of the same reasons we just discussed here. 8s are okay player for the cards, or cards for the players. But there's also some cards that are really bad. So specifically these cards, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These all have one unique scenario that makes them particularly bad for the player. Here's the problem. 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, the dealer never busts when drawing when they get one of these cards. Okay? A dealer is going to draw a card when they have 16 or less. Okay? So if they have 14 or whatever, 15, in any scenario you can imagine, if they draw one of these cards, they are not busting. So these are never bust cards. These are the only 4 cards in the deck, well, plus the ace, in which the dealer would never bust. So these are particularly bad cards. They also don't really offer much to the player. They're terrible for double downs. Those scenarios where you're betting twice as much, they're really bad for those double downs. So if you've got 11 and the dealer is showing a 6, that's a great scenario. If you draw and you get a 4, that's crap, right? That's a bad draw. So these cards are really bad for the players. And furthermore, of course, you're never going to get blackjack with these cards, obviously. There's really no redeeming quality to 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. So these are really bad cards for the players. So taking all of that together, I've mentioned Wizard of Odds in class. The Wizard of Odds basically simulated millions and millions of hands in blackjack and estimated the value of different cards. And this is the percentage change in house advantage given some of the cards. So let's start with the cards that are bad for the player. The 2s, the 3s, the 4s, the 5s, and the 6s. These are the worst cards for the players. This is the percentage change in house advantage when you take out these cards. Okay? Again, we're thinking about taking out these cards. And I'll be sure to send you guys a link to the quick explanation that he has online. Okay? So the house advantage for like a normal game that you might play in Vegas, a typical game that has 6 decks, pays 3-2, sort of a run-of-the-mill game, it might have a house advantage to begin with of about 0.4%, okay? And that's assuming you're playing optimal strategy, which if you're watching this video, I hope you would, okay? So house advantage is about 0.4%, so it's pretty small to begin with. What this tells you is if you took a 4 out of that shoe and just threw it in the trash, okay, that would reduce the house advantage by about 0.12%. So you would have driven that house advantage down to about 0.28%. All right, so again, this is thinking about if you took the cards out, what value there would be. And this is just thinking about an individual card. If you just take 1 3 out of the shoe, the house advantage goes from 0.4 to about 0.3%. So if you could somehow play a game that has a bunch of these cards taken out of it, the player advantage would actually turn positive. The house advantage would go away and eventually turn negative. Okay? These are bad cards for the players. Take them out. That's good news. Now let's think about on the other side. Cards that are good for the player. The 9, the 10, and the ace. All right, now I'm not mentioning the 7 and 8 because they're pretty neutral. They're sort of not really good, not really bad. They're sort of in the middle. These are the cards that are particularly good for the player. The 9s, the 10s, and the aces. So if you were to remove these cards, this would be the effect on house advantage. So if you take out a 10, take out one of those face cards, the house advantage immediately goes up to 0.5%, ceteris paribus, okay? So these leaving the deck is bad news for you. These leaving the deck is good news for you, okay? So card counting is all about finding a scenario where there's lots of these cards and few of these cards left in the deck.